If you've ever had responsibility for coordinating people over time, you've probably noticed how quickly the mental load builds. You start tracking who's available, keep an eye on resources, you're deciding what needs attention now and what can wait. Messages pile up, something pings in Slack, something pings in Jira, a calendar reminder pops up, another thread appears in Teams before you finish the last one. And none of that is especially difficult on its own. Holding all of it in your head at once is where the effort shows up. Battle Brothers drops you straight into that situation, except it does it with mercenaries, smashed knees, missing ears, fractured skulls, empty coin purses, noble houses with contracts to see you hung, and a clock ticking down to the next time you need to make payroll. Battle Brothers gives us something unusually useful to work with. It's a game where team building, recruiting, training, equipment management, contract selection, money, trade routes, and battlefield positioning all stay active at the same time. You never finish one of these systems before another one demands attention. That makes it a clean environment for examining what your brain is doing when you manage a group under constraint. In this episode, I'm going to take the mechanics you're already juggling in Battle Brothers and map them onto the cognitive systems that support coordination, prioritization, and role management. That includes the brain regions involved in working memory and attentional control, the neurochemical systems that shape confidence and persistence, and the specific points where those systems begin to strain. To make sense of that experience, I'm going to lean on three authors who studied these problems from different angles. Each one gives us a different way to diagnose the same workload. The goal here is to give you language for recognizing when coordination itself becomes the limiting factor. You're hiring people without knowing how long they'll remain useful. You're training them into roles that can shift after injuries or equipment changes. You're managing gear that wears down and demands replacement. You're choosing contracts that affect fatigue, morale, future options, skills. You're watching money, not just as income, but as a buffer against mistakes. You're moving between towns, making trade-offs about time and risk. You're moving trade resource, trade goods. You're positioning multiple units on a battlefield where losses don't reset. And by the way, there's permadeath. Your units can suffer permanent injuries, death, and all the money you invested in them is gone. All the gear you equipped them is gone. So the consequences are very permanent in this game. At the same time, there's a quieter layer that stays active. Injuries take time to heal, fatigue limits where you can put your guys, morale spreads, meaning if units have bad morale, it'll get worse, or if they have good morale, they'll have bonuses, so you'll have to manage that. Gear breaks, replacement and repair costs money, losses of units leave gaps in your builds and your formations that don't neatly close. Each of these systems is understandable. None of them is particularly complicated. The difficulty comes from the fact that they never shut off while you're dealing with the others. Changes propagate, a hiring decision alters equipment needs, equipment affects positioning, positioning affects injury risk, injuries affect which contracts are viable, contracts affect money, money affects hiring. Some of us have some experience dealing with this, and some of us have a lot. The loop stays closed, and responsibility stays with you. This is where it helps to step outside the game and bring in a framework designed to describe this kind of cognitive load. To understand why this kind of management starts to feel heavy, even when you know what you're doing, I want to bring in Herbert Simon. Simon was a political scientist and organizational theorist who studied how people make decisions inside complex institutions. In administrative behavior, he examined why capable individuals struggle when they're responsible for systems with many interacting parts. One of the ideas he's best known for is bounded rationality. The basic claim is that people operate with limited cognitive capacity. As systems become more complex, individuals simplify, rely on categories, and approximate in order to keep functioning, which describes Battle Brothers pretty accurately. At any given moment, the player's tracking team composition, health, fatigue, morale, equipment, condition, money as future flexibility, contract sequencing, and battle positioning. None of these considerations pauses while the others are addressed. Now, neuroanatomically, this work leans heavily on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which supports working memory and rule maintenance. That system has a finite capacity. As the number of active variables grows, precision gives way to shorthand. And from Simon's perspective, the important question is how much coordination a single mind can sustain while all of these variables remain active. And one of the ways that the brain conserves capacity is by compressing details. So in Battle Brothers, this shows up when units stop being individuals and start being roles. One is treated as a frontline unit or a backliner. That label carries a lot of cognitive weight. For example, this one's got a bow, this one's got a pole arm, this one's got a shield and spear up front, and your decisions become faster, fewer details need to be reevaluated. This compression again relies on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where updating a role requires attention and spare capacity. And under sustained load, updates lag behind reality. So a unit hired for the front line may continue to be treated that way after injuries, or fatigue might make that role increasingly more dangerous, and this abstraction persists longer than the conditions that justified it. So over time, it produces rigidity and adjustments feel costly. You make suboptimal decisions. Restructuring is disruptive. The organization drifts without anyone intending it to. Now, to describe what it actually feels like to operate inside that cognitive limit, Henry Mintzberg is useful. Mintzberg is a management scholar who studies how managers spend their time in practice. He wrote The Nature of Managerial Work, where he describes management as fragmented and interruption-driven. His research shows managers switching constantly between responsibilities. Planning's interrupted, one task gives way to another before it's finished. Battle Brothers mirrors this closely. You move from recruiting to budgeting to evaluating contracts to managing injuries to positioning units, often within the same in-game day. You're making purchasing decisions. You're checking different prices in markets, the plans get interrupted and your resources have to shift and your priorities change, you're taking different contracts. Cognitively, this taxes attentional control systems, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps manage competing demands. As load increases, prioritization becomes much harder. And the fatigue players describe doesn't come from any single task being difficult. It comes from continuous switching without resolution, much like in real-life management situations. Contract selection presents itself as a series of clear choices. You get offered a job, you evaluate it, you see what risks are involved, you see the reward, which you can negotiate for, you evaluate these decisions, and you have to take into account, can your team handle this? Is the pay acceptable? Do I have the gear to handle this? And what's harder to perceive is how these choices interact over time. So your gear is wearing down, your fatigue is accumulating, your units are more injured than they were before, you've got lower morale maybe, you've still got to make payroll on a daily basis. Do you have enough gold to last long enough to the payday from this mission? Money functions as an organizational flexibility. It determines how many errors you can make and absorb before your options start to run out and you're facing that game over screen for the 1,000th time. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex responds more strongly to visible damage than to shrinking option space. So as a result, the loss of your flexibility is often noticed too late, and your company can keep operating and your decisions continue to feel reasonable, but things are quickly spiraling downwards. To understand how people interpret their own decisions once things start going sideways, Daniel Kahneman gives us a clean lens. Kahneman was a psychologist who studied judgment under uncertainty. In Thinking Fast and Slow, he examined how people explain outcomes when information is incomplete. And one of his reoccurring observations is that people rely heavily on what's visible when constructing explanations. Hidden variables fade from the story. In Battle Brothers, coordination strain doesn't present itself directly. Dopamine reinforces recent success, sustaining confidence even as flexibility declines. So when that game over screen finally comes, your hindsight compresses a long sequence of minor failures into a single apparent mistake. And from Kahneman's perspective, this interpretation is predictable. So what's this giving you? Taking everything into account, these perspectives align. Simon describes the capacity limit, Mintzberg describes the lived experience, and Kahneman describes how that experience gets misread. So Battle Brothers keeps every management consideration active at once and asks a single person to coordinate them. Seeing that clearly gives you a diagnostic skill, right? You can tell when strain comes from poor judgment and when it comes from coordination overload. You'll notice when your decision-making gets too stiff, and you can recognize when your confidence is way beyond where you ought to have been flexible. And that applies inside the game and anywhere people manage teams under constraint. Battle Brothers often gets described as harsh, and what sustains it is something quieter. It exposes the cognitive work of holding a system together as coordination demands rise. Getting overwhelmed in Battle Brothers is usually from an accumulation of all of the information that you could have seen. The thing to remember about the responsibility of the managerial position in Battle Brothers is it's not hiding any information from you. The core is that it's giving you an overwhelming amount of visible information. The injuries, the equipment, the hiring, the contracts, the goblins, the orcs, the undead, everything accumulates. And once you notice that, the experience shifts. Situations that used to feel like poor judgment start to read as coordination limits being reached. Fatigue feels less personal, and you're less surprised when everything just sort of starts to feel like it's falling apart. That change in interpretation is the point of this episode. I hope that's what I'm conveying. It's not a way to play better, but as a way to recognize what kind of cognitive work you're actually doing when you're holding a team together under constraint. I hope this gives you a way to recognize when your job stops being about decision and starts being about coordination.